The White House had always been a symbol of power, a beacon of democracy, and a place where decisions shaped the fate of millions. Its corridors had echoed with the footsteps of leaders who carried the weight of the nation on their shoulders. But tonight, as President Michael Harlan sat alone in the Oval Office, he felt the crushing weight of something far more sinister. The fire in the hearth flickered weakly, casting long, eerie shadows across the room, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the October cold outside. It was the presence of his advisor, Ethan Crowley, that made Harlan's skin crawl. Crowley had been with him since the very beginning, a figure as constant as the walls of the White House itself. His tall, lean frame was always impeccably dressed, his suit blacker than night, and his pale, thin lips always curled into a knowing smile. His eyes gleamed with a darkness that was unnatural, and every word he spoke seemed to carry with it the weight of an unseen force. President Harlan rubbed his temples, trying to ward off the pounding headache that had become a permanent fixture in his life since Crowley had entered it. He had been an idealist once, full of hope and ambition, ready to change the country for the better. He had run for office with the best of intentions, promising reform, unity, and a future where the American dream could thrive once again. But Washington had its own agenda, and it didn't care for Harlan's lofty ideals. He had been just another senator back then, struggling to push through legislation that no one cared about, drowning in a sea of political games he didn't know how to play. He was on the verge of losing everything. His campaign was faltering, his supporters were waning, and the media had started to turn on him. It was during one of his lowest moments that Crowley had appeared, offering a lifeline. "Mr. Harlan," Crowley had said, his voice smooth as silk, "I can help you. You want to make a difference, but the system is rigged against you. You need power, real power, if you're going to change anything, and I can give it to you." At first, Harlan had been skeptical. Crowley had seemed too good to be true, a stranger who appeared out of nowhere with promises that sounded like a fantasy. But desperation had clouded his judgment. Harlan had asked what Crowley wanted in return for this power. Crowley had simply smiled, his eyes glinting in a way that sent a shiver down Harlan's spine. "Nothing you'll miss," Crowley had replied, his voice smooth but with a darkness lurking just beneath the surface. "Only your soul." Harlan had laughed it off at the time, convinced that Crowley was speaking in metaphor, but the more they talked, the more Harlan realized that Crowley wasn't joking. He was offering a deal, real power in exchange for something intangible, something Harlan thought he didn't believe in. The devil himself had come knocking, and Harlan, blinded by ambition and the desperation to rise above the swamp of Washington, had signed his soul away. The presidency had come swiftly after that. Doors that had once been closed were flung open. Allies emerged from every corner. Donations flooded in, and his campaign surged ahead with unprecedented momentum. He had won in a landslide, hailed as the president who would bring real change. But as the years passed, Harlan began to realize the true cost of his deal. Crowley, who had once seemed like a helpful advisor, had become his constant shadow, always lurking, always watching. His advice, at first subtle and sound, became more insidious. Crowley would whisper in Harlan's ear during cabinet meetings, urging him to make decisions that went against everything he had once stood for. It started with small compromises, favors to donors, leniency on corporate regulations, a blind eye to injustices in exchange for political capital. But soon, it escalated. War, bloodshed, greed. Crowley had urged Harlan to send troops into conflicts where there were no clear enemies, wars fought for profit and power. Harlan had justified it at first. "The country needs stability," he had told himself. "We need to be strong, to protect our interests." But deep down, he knew he was lying. He had become a puppet, and the strings were held by Crowley, by the devil himself. With every decision he made, Harlan felt his soul being chipped away piece by piece. His popularity plummeted. The public, once adoring, began to turn on him. Scandals erupted, wars dragged on, and the economy faltered. And yet, Harlan's personal wealth grew. His investments, quietly guided by Crowley, prospered from the very wars and chaos he had helped create. But it was a hollow victory. He had sold out his country, and he knew it. Late at night, when the halls of the White House were silent, Crowley would come to him. They would sit in the Oval Office, the fire casting long shadows, and Crowley would remind him of the deal they had made. Harlan could feel the chains tightening around him, chains he could never see but always felt. "I want out," Harlan had whispered one night, his voice trembling with fear and regret. I can't do this anymore." Crowley had smiled that same cold, knowing smile. "You made a deal, Mr. President. There is no out. You wanted power, and now you have it. But power comes with a price." Harlan had tried to fight back, tried to resist the devil's influence, but every time he did, something went wrong. A scandal would break in the news. A trusted ally would betray him. His family had begun to suffer too. His wife, once vibrant and full of life, had grown distant, their marriage a hollow shell. His children, once proud of their father, had stopped calling, stopped visiting. They were ashamed of what he had become, and Harlan knew it. Crowley had watched it all with cold amusement, always there to offer his twisted form of comfort. "This is what you wanted," he would say. "This is the cost of greatness." But Harlan no longer cared about greatness. He just wanted to be free. And that's when Crowley had made him an offer. "There is a way out," Crowley had said, his voice low and almost sympathetic. "But you won't like the price." "I'll do anything," Harlan had pleaded. "Just let me go. I don't care about the power, the money, any of it. I just want my life back." Crowley's eyes had glinted with malice as he leaned in closer. "Very well," he had whispered. "I'll release you from our deal. But know this, when you break a deal with the devil, the price is steep." The next morning, Harlan's world had come crashing down. The media had gotten hold of documents proving his involvement in illegal dealings, warmongering for profit, and a web of corruption so vast it made headlines around the world. His approval rating plummeted to the lowest in history. His party abandoned him, his closest allies turned their backs, and his family suffered the most unspeakable tragedy. His son, caught in a scandal of his own, had taken his life, unable to bear the weight of the shame his father had brought upon the family name. Harlan stood at the edge of the Oval Office, staring out at the darkened streets of Washington. He had thought he could escape, that Crowley would let him walk away. But now, with his legacy in ruins, his family broken, and his soul still in chains, he realized there was no escaping the deal he had made. He would forever be remembered as the worst president in the history of the United States, a man who had sold out his country for power and money, only to lose everything that truly mattered. As Harlan packed his belongings, ready to leave the White House for the last time, Crowley appeared once more, standing in the doorway, watching him with that same cold smile. "Goodbye, Mr. President," Crowley said softly. "I'll see you again." Harlan didn't reply. He didn't have the strength. As he walked past Crowley, he could feel the weight of the devil's gaze on his back, a reminder that no matter how far he tried to run, the deal would follow him, forever. Years later, on the campaign trail, a fresh-faced candidate stood in the shadows of a rally stage, ready to address the roaring crowd. He was young, idealistic, full of hope, much like Michael Harlan had once been. As he rehearsed his speech, a man in a dark suit approached him. The candidate glanced up, his eyes filled with the excitement of a man on the brink of something great. "You've got a lot of potential," the man said, his voice smooth and compelling. "But if you want to win, really win, you'll need a little help. I can make you an offer." The candidate smiled, oblivious to the darkness lurking beneath the man's words. "What's your name?" he asked. "Crowley," the man replied with a sly smile. "And I'm here to help you make history."